Just a nurse. That was what Dr. Marcus Mercer called Elena Martinez when he passed her in the cardiac wing hallway at 6:44 a.m. on a Tuesday in Savannah, his voice carrying the practiced dismissal of a man who had never learned the difference between observation and understanding. He didn't look at her. He was reviewing patient charts on an iPad, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the linoleum with the precision of a metronome, and he moved through the corridor as though the nurses moving around him were architectural features, walls that happened to breathe. Elena heard him say it to his resident, who laughed nervously. She didn't break stride. Her scrubs were perfectly pressed, her dark hair pulled back so tight it pulled her temples smooth, and her badge clipped to her collar bore only a name and a license number. Nothing else. No unit insignia. No decorations. No story. Cedar Creek Medical's cardiac wing occupied the third floor of a building constructed in 1998, renovated in 2014, and staffed by people who had never learned to look carefully at each other. The walls were painted a color that hospitals had collectively decided was soothing, a beige that approximated the inside of a mushroom, and the fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that made time feel distorted, as though the hallway existed slightly outside of normal reality. Elena had worked here for 5 years. 5 years of moving invisibly through these corridors. 5 years of compression ratios and drip calculations and the particular art of being present without being seen. The ventilation system hummed its mechanical rhythm overhead, and beneath that hum was the muffled sound of lives being calibrated by machines and medication. She knew Cedar Creek Medical better than she knew her own apartment. She knew where the crash cart wheels squeaked on the linoleum. She knew that the third-floor supply closet's refrigerator kept saline to exactly 4.2 degrees Celsius. She knew the names of all 43 nurses on the cardiac floor and the exact angle at which each resident tilted their head when they were about to make a decision they weren't confident about. She knew these things because Captain Elena Martinez, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Ramadi, 2006, had learned long ago that survival was built on the accumulation of small details. She moved toward the medication dispensary with the kind of unhurried efficiency that comes from muscle memory so deep it had become invisible. Her fingers traced the computer screen, accessing patient records, cross-referencing orders, checking for the specific complications that a certain Navy admiral might develop if certain conditions were monitored closely enough. The morning light slanted through the hallway windows at 6:52 a.m., and the light fell across her forearms, revealing faint burn scars across her knuckles, thin white lines that looked almost like a pattern if you knew how to read them. Most people didn't know how to read them. Most people didn't look closely enough. The scar tissue had faded over 16 years, becoming part of her skin the way trauma becomes part of a life, still present, but normalized into invisibility. Her hands, as she worked through the medication dispensary, were steady as surgical steel. They didn't tremble. They never trembled. Trembling was a luxury for people who had the luxury of falling apart. Elena had learned that lesson on a street in Ramadi on a day when the temperature had hit 127 degrees and the world had narrowed down to a single question: what comes next? What came next, at 7:15 a.m., was Admiral Richard Kessler's arrival for his weekly cardiac consultation. He came up the elevator in a pressed navy blue polo shirt and tan slacks, his white hair precise and military. He's bearing the kind that came from 40 years of command. He walked with the careful dignity of a man whose body had started sending him instructions he didn't like: slow down, be cautious, pay attention to your heart, and he clearly hated every second of it. His aide, a young ensign named Morrison, walked 3 steps behind him, carrying Kessler's medical records in a folder marked with a red tab indicating priority access. The Admiral moved through the cardiac wing with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being seen, acknowledged, and deferred to. Nurses glanced up as he passed. Residents straightened their posture. Dr. Mercer appeared from his office with a smile that looked rehearsed and genuine simultaneously, which Elena knew meant it was entirely genuine, the smile of a man who had mastered the appearance of human warmth without ever experiencing it. Elena stood near the medication dispensary, her eyes on a screen displaying patient vitals, and she watched the Admiral move past her without acknowledgement. He was 3 feet away. His left forearm was visible beneath the sleeve of his polo, and beneath his skin was a tattoo partially visible, black ink forming letters in an angular military script, Elena Martinez, Ramadi. The tattoo was exactly 16 years old. He did not glance in her direction. She did not glance in his. The mutual invisibility was the mission. It was also, after 5 years, beginning to feel like something else entirely. Elena waited until Kessler was settled in consultation room 3, then moved with her medication cart down the adjacent hallway. She had access to consultation room 3's observation window, the kind of access that made it appear she was doing routine work, collecting specimens, checking on an adjacent patient's full line. The Admiral sat in a chair that was designed to make sitting feel vaguely official, his hands resting on his thighs, his expression composed in the way that required a lifetime of training to achieve. Dr. Mercer was speaking, his words moving with the careful precision of someone selling something he didn't quite believe in. Elena heard him say, "We're maintaining your current medication regimen. Standard EKG shows no concerning changes." She saw the Admiral nod, saw the small tension in his shoulders relax incrementally. His heart was strong. His prognosis was stable. There was no emergency. There was only the routine maintenance of a life that had already survived things most people could not imagine. Elena pulled out her encrypted phone, unmarked, unregistered, a piece of equipment that had never appeared on any hospital inventory, and she made a notation. The 15th of July. 7:34 a.m. Admiral Kessler. Consultation complete. Vital stable. No complications. No contact. The mission continued. The surveillance continued. The 5-year assignment that had consumed her entire existence continued. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had almost forgotten why she was here. Captain Elena Martinez had been sent to Cedar Creek Medical 5 years ago by a division of the Navy that didn't officially exist, to monitor a man who had requested, in a moment of vulnerability that had never been made public, protection from a threat that had never been specified. The intelligence indicated potential foreign agents attempting to access the Admiral's classified knowledge. The protocol dictated close observation, daily surveillance, immediate response if any breach occurred. The file on Elena's classified phone designated her as Unit Angel 6, a protected observer status that meant she could use lethal force if necessary to maintain the security perimeter. What the file did not designate was how her hands would respond to seeing him move through the world, alive, dignified, untouchable, and completely unaware that she had already saved his life twice in the 5 years she had been watching him. The first time was a medication error caught at 2:11 a.m. The second time was a dietary supplement interaction flagged by an algorithm running on her encrypted phone. Both times, she had prevented the complication, prevented the crisis, prevented anything that would draw attention to why someone needed to be protected. Both times, he had looked through her like she was part of the building architecture. Dr. Mercer emerged from consultation room 3 at 7:51 a.m. and moved toward his office with the particular swagger of a man who had never experienced consequences. Elena watched him pass, watched the way his eyes registered nothing about her except perhaps a vague sense of obstacle, a thing in space that occupied his periphery without claiming his attention. He wore a watch that cost $12,000, a gesture of wealth designed to communicate hierarchy. His cologne was expensive and excessive. His suit had probably cost more than Elena made in a month, though this had never seemed to trouble him. What did seem to trouble him, if Elena was reading the micro-expressions correctly, was something written in the patient chart he was reviewing. His pace slowed. His jaw tightened. He made a notation on the chart with the quick, aggressive strokes of someone making a decision that would affect other people without consulting them first. Elena watched him disappear into his office, and then she began the careful work of accessing his schedule. What he didn't know was that her role at Cedar Creek wasn't limited to monitoring the Admiral. She was also supposed to be monitoring the people around him. The people with access to his records. The people with the authority to order tests, to make medical decisions, to influence the trajectory of his care. The people like Dr. Marcus Mercer. Elena moved through her shift with the kind of precision that comes from operating on a level of detail most people never notice. When she was assigned to assist with medication rounds on the cardiac floor, she verified every order, cross-referenced every drug, checked every dosage with the intensity of someone diffusing an explosive device. When she documented patient vitals, she included not just the numbers but the context, the time, the circumstances, the exact position of the patient, the presence of any other staff members who might have had access to the care plan. When she performed compression CPR on Mr. Harrison in room 317, her compressions maintained exactly 100 to 120 beats per minute, the kind of rhythmic, metronomic precision that made the resident assisting her watch in fascination. But then, the moment the attending physician arrived, a man named Dr. Chen who actually knew what he was doing, Elena stepped back. She moved away from the patient. She let the hierarchy reassert itself. She became invisible again. In the break room at 2:15 p.m., Elena sat alone and opened her encrypted phone. The display showed 42 messages from naval intelligence analysts, classified folders about foreign agents and potential breaches, intelligence reports from 3 different government agencies. She scrolled through them with the expression of someone reading nothing particularly remarkable, and her eyes caught on one file marked Priority, Cross-Reference. It was a note from her handler, a man whose name she had never been given and whose voice she had never heard except filtered through an encrypted signal. The note was brief, subject continues standard routine. Secondary monitoring on Dr. M. Mercer indicates possible financial irregularities. Recommend expanded access. Maintain current posture. Expanded access. Which meant her handler knew something about Dr. Mercer that suggested he was more than just an arrogant physician. Which meant the assignment was about to become more complicated than surveillance. Which meant that whatever was happening in Cedar Creek Medical's walls, Elena was going to need to understand it before it threatened the Admiral. She closed the phone and touched the patch inside her jacket lining, the faded unit designation from 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, worn and bloodstained from a mission that had ended 16 years ago in a city that had stopped being real to her somewhere around the 3rd year of being invisible. The patch was proof. Evidence. Witness to the fact that Captain Elena Martinez had been someone before she became a nurse. The faded fabric felt smooth against her fingertips, familiar as scar tissue. She let her hand fall away and returned to the cardiac floor, where Admiral Kessler was preparing to leave his consultation, where Dr. Mercer was reviewing patient charts with the particular focus of someone plotting something, where the mission continued in its careful, invisible, 5-year-old silence. The next voice she heard, at 3:42 p.m., came through her encrypted phone as a priority alert. A single word, careful. Her handler had seen something in the data. Had flagged something in Mercer's financial records or his access logs or his interactions with the Admiral's care plan. Something that suggested the threat to Admiral Kessler was not external. It was internal. It was walking through Cedar Creek Medical's halls wearing Italian shoes and a smile that had never reached his eyes. The Grand Rounds Assembly filled Cedar Creek Medical's largest conference room like a courtroom designed for public execution. 40 physicians, residents, and senior nurses occupied the tiered rows, their attention locked on the podium where Dr. Marcus Mercer stood with the precision of a man who had never questioned his own authority. Elena Martinez sat in the front row, her white coat pressed, her badge clipped to her scrubs at exactly the regulation angle. She kept her eyes flat and cold. "This," Mercer announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room with a practiced projection of someone accustomed to absolute deference, "is what dangerously overconfident nursing looks like." He gestured toward Elena as though she were a diagnostic specimen under glass. "Miss Martinez here questioned my order to delay a cardiac consult for a Medicare patient. Apparently, her associate degree trumps my 15 years of cardiology training." His smile widened. The residents laughed, the ripple of nervous energy that always followed the predator's first kill. Elena didn't flinch. Muscle memory took over. She had survived 3 tours in Ramadi where the sound of small arms fire was called Tuesday morning. A cardiologist's contempt was white noise. She watched Mercer's hands as he spoke, the Rolex catching the fluorescent light like a shark's fin cutting water. His power lived in that watch, that title, that room full of physicians who understood that hierarchy was a religion and he was its high priest. "The Martinez woman apparently believes," Mercer continued, building momentum like a prosecutor closing arguments, "that she understands the complexity of proper diagnostic protocols. He paused for effect. The silence stretched. Perhaps she'd prefer we skip all appropriate testing and simply rush patients through without billable procedures that actually generate revenue for the hospital. More laughter. Harder this time. Mercer glanced at the board members seated in the back row, the same board members who approved his consulting contract with his shell company Diagnostic Center, where 87% of Cedar Creek's cardiac patients were mysteriously referred for redundant imaging. 6 minutes, he spoke. Elena counted them by the second hand on the clock mounted above the door. 147 words designed to dismantle her credibility in front of 40 witnesses. He used the phrase "the Martinez woman" 3 separate times, each delivery layered with fresh contempt. Her qualification was questioned. Her judgment was mocked. Her credentials were implied to be fraudulent with the kind of surgical precision that left no fingerprints. This was stage 2 escalation, social attack, public mockery, deniability built in. When Mercer finally paused, searching for his closing flourish, Elena stood. The movement was fluid and unhurried, like a predator rising from grass. The room shifted. Something in her posture triggered a primitive instinct in 40 educated minds, the recognition that they were watching something that didn't belong caged. "Your ex-wife called yesterday asking if you'd signed the settlement yet, Doctor." Her voice was quiet enough to require the room to hold its breath. She sounded anxious. She mentioned something about the forensic accountant finding those offshore transfers you forgot to disclose to the divorce court. Mercer's face went purple. Actually purple, the color draining and flooding back like a pressure valve opening and closing. His mouth opened and closed without sound. Elena turned on her heel and walked away while every eye in that room followed the invisible nurse nobody had bothered to really see until the moment she became impossible to ignore. She didn't rush. She didn't acknowledge the sound of her footsteps echoing on the tile floor, didn't register the sharp intake of breath from 3 residents who suddenly understood they'd been complicit in something they would later regret. The doors clicked shut behind her. 3 days passed. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday morning dissolved into the fluorescent hum of Cedar Creek's endless corridors. Elena moved through her shifts like a ghost in scrubs, checking 4 lines and medication orders, noting Mercer's location on the 3rd floor cardiac wing through her encrypted surveillance application. She'd been trained to move invisibly through hostile environments. This was simply a different kind of war, fought without weapons and with everything to lose. Friday afternoon found her standing beside the vending machines on the 2nd floor, feeding $2 into the metal mouth of the device. The mechanical whir of the selection tumbling down was her only company. She didn't hear Mercer approach, but she felt the shift in air pressure when he passed with 2 hospital board members, the same men who'd laughed during his presentation. "I'm beginning to wonder," Mercer's voice carried deliberately loud over his companion's conversation, "if that Martinez woman actually has legitimate credentials, or if she bought them online from one of those diploma mill websites." One board member chuckled. A real chuckle. The kind of laugh that preceded consequences. Elena's reflection in the vending machine's glass panel showed her jaw tighten. Just one muscle. One tiny compression of bone and sinew that she controlled in 0.3 seconds flat. She didn't turn. Didn't acknowledge. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. That was restraint. That was the discipline that had kept her alive in Ramadi when every instinct screamed to move, to fight, to end the threat. She'd learned then that the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was power compressed until it became diamond. The board members moved past. Mercer's voice faded down the corridor. Elena's hand remained steady as she retrieved her vending machine purchase, a pack of peanuts and a bottle of water. Both held in a grip that could have crushed steel. But that wasn't the worst part. Friday afternoon, 1,427 hours. Elena had just finished her shift and was updating her patient notes when Mercer appeared in the nurse's station with a security guard positioned precisely 2 steps behind his left shoulder. Not close enough to seem confrontational. Just close enough to make the implicit threat unavoidable. This was stage 3 escalation, weaponizing institutional power, turning policy into a blade. "Elena." He said her first name with the kind of familiarity that was designed to demean, to collapse professional distance into something personal and vulnerable. "I need you to understand something clearly." He set a blank resignation form on the counter between them. His fingers were steady. His smile was thin and confident, like a wolf showing its teeth. "If you don't submit your resignation by Monday morning, security will escort you out in front of everyone. In front of the staff, the patients, the visitors. The full humiliation of termination." He paused, letting that image settle. "I'm giving you the dignity of choice." Elena looked at the resignation form. At the blank line where her signature belonged. At his hand resting on the counter like it owned the space. "Think about what's best for your family," Mercer continued, his voice dropping into the register of fatherly concern. "Your son. Doesn't he apply to college next year? Doesn't he want to go to a good school? The kind that looks carefully at his mother's employment history." The threat was perfectly calibrated. Not illegal. Not actionable. Just specific enough to reach into her chest and compress her heart. Elena's hands remained flat on the counter. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and quiet. "I'll submit my decision by Monday." Mercer nodded, turned, and walked away with his security shadow trailing behind him like a piece of his own darkness had learned to follow. The nurses around the station slowly returned to their charts, their computer screens, their careful pretense that nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Elena drove home through Savannah traffic, the afternoon heat pressing against the windows of her Subaru like a living thing. The city opened around her, Spanish moss hanging from oaks like the remnants of some old grief, the river smell mixing with diesel and heat. She'd been in Cedar Creek for 5 years. 1,827 days of watching Admiral Richard Kessler receive his cardiac evaluations while maintaining perfect invisibility. 1,827 days of intercepting 4 separate intelligence operations designed to exploit his position. 1,827 days of a mission so compartmentalized that even her own son didn't know who she really was. Her phone buzzed. Encrypted message. Subject line, Asset Kessler. Sunday overnight observation. 1800 to 0600 hours. 2 foreign operatives confirmed in Savannah area. Heightened alert. She acknowledged the message and deleted it. Sunday night was 3 days away. 3 days before the world shifted on its axis. 3 days before everything she'd protected for 5 years came down to a single moment where she would have to choose between maintaining her cover and keeping a man alive. The road ahead bent around a curve lined with heat-shimmering asphalt. Elena drove steady. Composed. Just another nurse heading home after her shift, unaware that Monday morning would end her career at Cedar Creek Medical, and Sunday night would end everything she'd sworn to protect. Sunday night at Cedar Creek Medical moved with the hollow rhythm of overnight shifts, the kind of quiet that only exists in hospitals after visiting hours end and the fluorescent lights hummed their lonely frequency. Elena Martinez had informed the charge nurse that morning she'd work her full schedule through Monday, regardless of what Dr. Mercer intended to do with his termination letter. She'd started this mission 5 years ago with a mission objective, and she wouldn't abandon her post before that mission was complete, even if the mission itself had become unraveling at the seams. The cardiac observation wing was subdued at 2,140 hours. Most patients slept under their blankets while machines breathed for them, monitored their hearts, recorded their decline or recovery in digital precision. Elena moved through the hallway with the practiced invisibility she'd perfected across 5 years, checking monitors, adjusting for flows, documenting vital signs with the detached competence of someone who was very good at being unremarkable. She wore her scrubs like camouflage. Her name tag read Martinez, RN. Nothing on it suggested she held a captain's rank, that she'd carried wounded Marines through Ramadi under sniper fire, that she'd been placed in this hospital specifically to monitor one man's movements and associations for reasons that went far beyond routine cardiac care. That man sat upright in room 412, reviewing classified documents on a military-grade tablet while his aide dozed in the visitor chair, head tilted back against the wall with his mouth slightly open. Admiral Richard Kessler had no idea she was watching. He never did. For 5 years, Elena had maintained perfect distance, close enough to protect, far enough to remain invisible. It was a delicate architecture of presence and absence, the kind of thing that required absolute discipline and the ability to be in a room without being seen in it. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one from her 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines deployment, felt heavier than usual tonight. She'd touched it this morning, the way she always did on difficult days, a small ritual of remembering who she really was beneath the scrubs and the deferential posture and the lowered voice. Kessler's breathing pattern changed at 2,147 hours. Elena caught it from her station in the hallway where she was pretending to document patient notes on the computer terminal. His respiratory rate had been steady at 16 breaths per minute when she'd checked his monitors 30 minutes earlier. Now the waveform on his remote telemetry screen showed something jagged and wrong, breathing elevated to 28, then 32, the kind of rapid, shallow respiration that meant the body was panicking even if the conscious mind hadn't caught up yet. His oxygen saturation was dropping in real time. 88, 86, 84, the numbers fell like a countdown she couldn't stop. She was moving before the alarm sounded, her body operating on something deeper than thought. The transition between watching and acting happened in the space between one heartbeat and another, a shift so instantaneous it felt like a door opening inside her chest. She entered room 412 without announcing herself, the kind of entry that came from years of moving through crisis spaces where hesitation cost lives. Kessler sat rigid against his pillows, one hand pressed against his right chest wall, his breathing fast and shallow like an animal in distress. His lips had begun to pale, the blood draining from his face in the way it did when the body was failing its own oxygen requirements. His eyes moved to her face but didn't focus, unfocused and desperate, the eyes of a man whose body was betraying him in real time. "Sir, I need you to stay still," Elena said, her voice dropping into the register she used only in emergencies, the voice that came from something military and old inside her, the voice that had shouted orders in dust storms and blood. She was already reaching for his shirt, already counting ribs with fingers that remembered doing this under mortar fire in a desert 7,000 miles away, already moving through the sequence that had saved lives in conditions infinitely worse than this climate-controlled cardiac wing. Dr. Chen arrived 90 seconds later, a second-year resident with the kind of face that still showed panic clearly written across it, no expertise yet to mask the fear. He was out of breath from running, his stethoscope already in his ears, and Elena watched his expression flatten as he listened to Kessler's chest. Absent breath sounds on the right side. The clinical reality that confirmed what Elena already knew, a pneumothorax, air trapped in the pleural space, the collapsed lung pressing against the heart like a closed fist. Absent breath sounds on the right, Chen whispered, his hands visibly shaking. "I think I need to call the attending. I should." His voice cracked the way young doctors' voices did when they were confronting the weight of a life in their hands and discovering they weren't ready for it. Kessler's oxygen saturation continued its descent. 84, 82, 80. The numbers weren't suggestions anymore, they were an execution timer, a clock counting down to the moment when the human body stops converting oxygen to life. Elena's training had taught her that tension pneumothorax was a survivable emergency if you moved fast, if you were decisive, if you understood that hesitation was the same as choosing death. Chen fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline, but Elena was already moving past him toward the crash cart, already calculating the precise coordinates where the needle would go, the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, the exact location where the trapped air was pushing against Kessler's lungs like a slowly tightening hand. She grabbed the 14-gauge needle with the kind of certainty that came from hands that had done this before, had learned it not in simulation or residency but in the real world where people died if you got it wrong. The adhesive packet came open in 3 seconds. Her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone operating from muscle memory so deep it felt like instinct. She prepped his skin with betadine, the smell of iodine sharp in the suddenly tight air of the room, and counted the ribs one more time with her fingers. 1, 2, right here, the second intercostal space where the collapsed lung was suffocating the man she'd been protecting for 5 years without him ever knowing her name. "This will hurt, sir," she said, and drove the needle between his ribs with one smooth motion. The hiss of air escaping came immediately, a sound like pressure releasing from a tire, like the sound of something broken finally finding the opportunity to fix itself. Kessler gasped, his body jerking against the bed, but his color returned almost instantly, the pale draining of his face reversing as his oxygen levels began their climb back toward life. 88, 92, 96, his breathing eased from the panicked rapid shallowness into something that resembled actual respiration. His eyes found her face again, and this time they held focus, held recognition of some kind, not of who she was, but of the fact that someone had just saved his life in the span of 6 seconds with the kind of competence that suggested this wasn't the first time her hands had done this work. "Call respiratory and get the chest tube tray," Elena said to Chen, the words a command not a request, the kind of sentence that came from someone accustomed to people obeying her voice. "Now." She said it with the kind of authority that made Chen move instantly, that made his hands stop shaking because they'd shifted from his own panic to the external structure of someone else's certainty. Elena maintained her hand on the needle, keeping the airway patent, monitoring Kessler's vital signs as they stabilized into something approaching normal, her eyes reading the monitors the way other people read text, instantly, automatically, without conscious effort. 20 minutes later, Kessler was intubated, stable, and surrounded by the overnight critical care team that had assembled around him with the coordinated precision of people who knew what a life-or-death emergency looked like. His chest tube was in place, draining air that had no right to be in his pleural cavity. His oxygen saturation had climbed to 97%. His heart rate had dropped from the panic tachycardia of crisis to the steady drum of recovery. Elena stood at the perimeter of the medical activity, watching the machines do their work, watching the monitors display the data that confirmed Kessler would survive this night, would wake tomorrow in a hospital bed with no memory of the woman whose hands had kept him alive for those 6 crucial seconds. That was the moment Dr. Mercer arrived, pushing through the double doors in street clothes, his hair uncombed, his eyes still holding the dullness of interrupted sleep, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested he'd received a phone call he couldn't ignore. His gaze swept across the room, across the monitors and the machines and the team working with practiced efficiency, and then locked directly onto Elena, standing motionless in the corner of the room, her hands at her sides, her expression as flat and controlled as it had been in grand rounds when he'd called her dangerously overconfident. For 3 seconds, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sounds were the machines doing their mechanical work, the ventilator wheeze, the cardiac monitor beeping its steady rhythm, the hiss of oxygen flowing through tubes, and in that silence, Elena understood that her mission had just ended. Everything she'd built across 5 years of invisible protection had been dismantled in 6 seconds of visible competence, and there was no way to rebuild it, no way to unsee what Dr. Mercer was seeing, no way to pretend she was anything less than exactly what her hands had just proven her to be. Dr. Mercer didn't speak to Elena in the ICU. He reviewed Kessler's chart, nodded at the attending's report about stable vitals and successful intubation, then stepped into the hallway where his voice carried through the walls like a blade being sharpened. Elena watched through the glass partition as he paced, his free hand jabbing the air in calculated gestures. First call lasted 14 minutes. Second call 7. Third call 22 minutes. By the third one, his jaw had tightened into something that resembled a smile, and Elena understood without hearing a single word that he'd made arrangements. He hadn't just lost a patient, he'd lost control, and men like Mercer didn't tolerate that particular failure. At 0600, as Elena finished her shift documentation with hands that refused to betray her, the charge nurse pulled her into the supply closet, that fluorescent-lit tomb where bad news always came wrapped in whispers. The state nursing board called, the nurse said, her eyes avoiding Elena's. "There's an emergency review of your license. Practicing beyond scope. They want you off clinical shifts until it's resolved." Elena nodded once and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Mercer had moved from social attacks to institutional sabotage, and he'd done it with surgical precision. He'd weaponized her heroism against her. The one thing that might save her career, the needle decompression that had brought Kessler back from the edge, was now the weapon lodged between her ribs. At 0830, Elena's personal phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the nursing director from her previous hospital in Jacksonville, the woman who'd written her recommendation letters when she'd transferred to Cedar Creek 5 years ago. Elena, I don't know what's happening, but someone called here this morning asking very specific questions about your employment. Questions about credential verification, disciplinary actions, patient complaints. They already seem to have a narrative. I told them you were exemplary, but they sounded like they didn't believe me. Hayes paused. Who did you anger? Elena said, nobody. I didn't mean to, and Hayes understood. A hospital director always understood. Phone calls like that came from people with institutional weight and something to prove. Phone calls like that meant the damage had already calcified into official records. The silence after Hayes hung up felt heavier than the one in Ramadi when the convoy had stopped moving. Monday morning, 0900, Mercer arrived at the nurses' station with the same security guard from Friday, the one whose presence transformed hallways into interrogation rooms. Mercer carried a hospital envelope in his left hand, and his right hand hung at his side like a weapon he didn't need to draw. He found Elena at her charting station, where she'd been deliberately visible, deliberately working, deliberately demonstrating that she hadn't run. That was the message she decided to send. I'm not ashamed of saving his life. Mercer smiled, and the smile was the worst thing he'd done all morning. Elena Martinez. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated for performing procedures beyond your license scope and for insubordination. He extended the envelope, and his voice modulated into something rehearsed, something that had already been vetted by hospital legal. You have 15 minutes to clear your locker. The security guard stepped closer, a subtle shift that said the offer of cooperation was about to expire. Elena took the envelope and said, "Understood, Dr. Mercer," and watched his jaw tighten at the formality of it. He'd wanted anger. He'd wanted tears. He'd wanted the satisfaction of breaking her in public the way she'd embarrassed him in front of the board. Instead, she'd given him a nurse-following protocol. She'd given him composure, and composure was a blade he couldn't fight. She walked to the locker room with her head level, her breathing controlled, the kind of calm that came from having already survived worse. Inside her jacket, the faded unit patch from Ramadi felt like it was made of lead, a piece of canvas and thread that carried 5 years of invisible sacrifice, 5 years of watching Kessler walk past her without recognition, 5 years of maintaining cover while foreign operatives tested the perimeter of his knowledge, and she'd burned it all in 6 seconds of visible competence. The mission wasn't just compromised. It was incinerated. Someone else would have to take the monitoring now. Someone new would have to learn Kessler's patterns, his visitors, his communications. The operatives she'd been tracking, the ones who'd been probing his knowledge of Pacific Fleet deployments, would sense the shift in surveillance density and adjust their approach. And Captain Elena Martinez, the invisible guardian, would be gone. She cleared the locker in 90 seconds. 2 surgical caps. A spare stethoscope. The photograph of Daniel from 8th grade, before his voice changed and his shoulders broadened. She didn't look at the unit patch as she retrieved it from the jacket lining. She just felt it against her palm, rough canvas, faded embroidery spelling out Ramadi, 2006, 3rd Battalion 5th Marines. A piece of proof that she'd been more than a nurse. A piece of evidence that the world had almost broken her once and she'd carried 3 men out of the fire anyway. The security guard waited 15 feet away, his presence a timer counting down. Elena zipped her bag and walked past him without meeting his eyes. That was the message Mercer would receive: you didn't break her. You just removed her. At 14:30, Elena sat at her kitchen table with the termination letter spread in front of her like an autopsy report. The letterhead read, Cedar Creek Medical, Human Resources Department. The language was clinical: performance deficiencies, scope of practice violations, inability to follow chain of command. Each phrase was a knife cut, precise, intentional, designed to look reasonable to anyone reading it. The termination letter didn't mention that she'd saved an admiral's life. It didn't mention that the needle decompression had been technically perfect, textbook precision, the kind of intervention that should have garnered commendation. It just said she'd exceeded authority and must be removed. Mercer had won. He'd managed what institutional pressure couldn't do. He'd removed her from the field without anyone ever knowing there was a field to begin with. Daniel came home at 14:45, dropping his backpack by the door like he always did, his trajectory toward the kitchen automatic until he saw her sitting motionless at the table with her hand splayed flat on the wood grain. He stopped. 16 years old and already reading danger the way children of operators learn to read it, through micro-expressions and body angles and the particular quality of stillness that meant something had broken. "Mom? Why are you home?" His voice carried the weight of understanding that home wasn't where she was supposed to be at 14:45 on a Monday. The tears came before she could stop them, and that was the worst part, not the tears themselves, but the loss of control that preceded them. Her hands began to tremble, a betrayal of every protocol she'd maintained, every minute of composure she'd purchased with her silence. She couldn't explain that she'd failed the mission. She couldn't explain that she was a captain without a command, an operator without cover, a protector who'd been removed before the threat fully materialized. She couldn't explain that the man she'd kept safe for 5 years, the man whose name she carried like a classified document, didn't even know her real rank. She couldn't explain that in saving him, she destroyed everything. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, terrified in a way she'd never wanted him to be, watching his unbreakable mother crack like the hull of a ship that had survived the storm only to sink in calm water. Her son appeared in the Cedar Creek administrator's office the next morning without an appointment, without warning, carrying a shadow box that smelled like cedar and old leather. Daniel Martinez was 16, lanky in the way teenagers are when they haven't grown into their own height yet, but he moved through that office like someone who'd been raised by wolves and wolves alone. The shadow box was 3 feet long, mahogany backing with glass front, and inside it lay medals arranged in precise rows, ribbons in purple and bronze, a silver star that caught the morning light like a caught breath, 2 purple hearts, and at the bottom, a navy cross pinned to a fold of faded olive drab. He set it on the administrator's desk without ceremony. "Mom," he said, "they need to see these." The room went dead silent. Dr. Mercer was there. Of course he was there, seated in the leather chair reserved for terminated staff disciplinary proceedings, his attorney beside him reviewing the termination package one final time before signatures made it official. The shadow box stopped everything. The administrator's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The attorney's eyes moved from the legal document to the medals and back again, recalculating something in the mathematics of liability and reputation. Admiral Kessler was recovering in the cardiac wing 2 floors above. His ejection fraction was improving. His breathing was no longer labored. The needle decompression Elena had performed had expanded his left lung fully within 90 seconds, and the on-call resident, the one who'd frozen, had called her a genius before the code team even arrived. The Admiral remembered her hands. Steady. Certain. Moving like water finding its course. He remembered someone whispering his call sign in the dark of Ramadi, remembered being lifted when lifting felt impossible, remembered a voice saying, "I've got you, sir, just stay with me," and then nothing but the sound of boots and breathing and survival. He'd been searching for 5 years to find that voice again. Now he stood in the administrator's office, still weak from the pneumothorax, still wearing the hospital gown they hadn't bothered to change because he'd demanded to know about Elena, about what happened to her, about why the nurse who'd saved his life was being terminated for saving his life. His eyes fell on the shadow box. He read the name engraved on the back plate, Captain Elena Martinez, USMC, Ret. "Night Angel," he whispered. The words landed like a depth charge in shallow water. Everything changed. The administrator's expression shifted from administrative irritation to profound realization. Mercer's face went the color of bathroom tile. The attorney slowly removed his reading glasses. Admiral Kessler stepped toward the shadow box with the careful movements of a recovering cardiac patient, and when he reached it, when his eyes fully processed what he was seeing, tears began to stream down his face. Not quietly. Not discreetly. The kind of tears that come when you've been searching for someone in the dark for 5 years and they suddenly stand in front of you in the light. He raised his hand in salute, a proper military salute, fist to chest, to his former patient, to the woman who had carried him out of Ramadi when he was nobody important, to the nurse who'd been protecting him ever since without acknowledgement or recognition. A Marine veteran named Captain Thomas Halloway sat on the hospital board. He'd served in Fallujah, 2nd Battalion 7th Marines, and he recognized the significance of the medals the moment he saw them. He stood without being invited to speak, moved to the shadow box, and began reading the citation engraved on the backing. His voice was thick, combat-hardened men made soft by words that matter. Captain Elena Martinez carried 3 wounded personnel through a 6-hour firefight in the Jolan district. He read, each word deliberate and heavy. Under sustained small arms fire from multiple angles, she maintained protective positions while rendering emergency medical aid. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of all 3 casualties who were subsequently evacuated to medical facilities. His voice cracked slightly. For extraordinary heroism in combat, she is awarded the Silver Star. Dr. Mercer's face went from tile-white to the color of spoiled milk. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood like the sound of fingernails on blackboard. "This is irrelevant," he said, his voice sharp and fractured. "This is ancient history. Her nursing violations are bullshit," Admiral Kessler said quietly. He was still in the hospital gown. He was still recovering from a pneumothorax. He was still weak enough that his aide moved to steady him. But when he spoke, the room recognized authority, the kind that doesn't need to be loud, the kind that comes from commanding submarines and understanding the weight of classified intelligence and knowing exactly what you owe to someone who saved your life. 12 years ago, Kessler said, I was a lieutenant commander in Ramadi. Second tour. My convoy took fire near the courthouse. I took shrapnel through my left lung. I was bleeding out on the street, and this woman, Captain Martinez, carried me 3 miles to the nearest field hospital under active sniper fire. He looked directly at Mercer. While you were in your 2nd year of medical school, building your career, this woman was building her legend. He turned back to the shadow box. 5 years ago, she was reassigned to Cedar Creek Medical. Officially, she was a cardiac nurse. Unofficially, she was protecting me from people who wanted information I can't discuss. She did both jobs perfectly. And 3 days ago, when my lung collapsed again, when I would have died in this hospital, she broke 5 years of operational security to save my life. Again. Dr. Mercer's attorney was already standing, already moving toward the door, already calculating the liability exposure and understanding that his client had just been positioned as the antagonist in a federal intelligence operation. The attorney was a smart man. He knew when to exit a room that was about to belong to someone else. Within 90 minutes, Dr. Mercer made 3 phone calls from his office while his hand shook with the particular tremor that comes from sudden, total loss of institutional protection. His first call was to the hospital board chairman. The call went to voicemail. His second was to his private investigator, the man he'd hired to dig through Elena's background and uncover disqualifying secrets. The investigator answered on the second ring and said, I've already been contacted by Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They requested all documentation. I provided it. I'm cooperating fully. His third call was to his attorney, who informed him that the board chairman had already convened an emergency session and that the hospital's legal counsel was requesting a meeting regarding Mercer's employment status. The IT director's name was Patterson. He'd served in Afghanistan with the 160th SOR as a signals technician, and he understood systems the way poets understand words. When Mercer arrived at the IT department at 1,620 hours with his administrative credentials and requested access to the security server for patient care quality investigation, Patterson provided the access immediately and watched as Mercer's fingers flew across the keyboard with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for air. The files Mercer deleted told a story written in evidence. Mercer accessing patient billing records at 0237 hours on a Tuesday. Mercer meeting with the owner of Diagnostic Imaging Solutions LLC in the Cedar Creek parking garage. Mercer's signature on medication dispensation logs that didn't match the actual medications dispensed. Mercer's hand in a manila envelope being exchanged for what looked like a deposit slip. Patterson didn't stop him. He didn't say a word. Every file deletion was being mirrored to an external drive Patterson personally controlled and simultaneously uploaded to a secure server that Patterson's brother-in-law managed. After 40 minutes, Mercer deleted the final file, cleared the recycle bin with the certainty of someone who believed deletion meant erasure, and thanked Patterson for his assistance. Patterson waited 10 minutes. Then he called the FBI field office in Savannah and the State Medical Fraud Division. By Wednesday morning, federal investigators arrived with a warrant. They recovered every deleted file, timestamp proving Mercer's consciousness of guilt, every deletion recorded in the backup Patterson had so generously maintained. The forensic accounting took 3 days. It revealed $1.2 million in kickbacks from unnecessary diagnostic testing. It revealed shell companies. It revealed a pattern of systematic fraud that stretched back for years. Mercer's attorney negotiated for 18 hours before accepting a plea agreement, full restitution, permanent surrender of his medical license, 2 years in federal prison suspended to probation, and 500 hours of community service. Thursday afternoon, Dr. Marcus Mercer taught his first CPR class at Savannah Community College for $12 an hour. The classroom smelled like industrial cleaner and broken dreams. Plastic CPR mannequins were arranged in rows like patients awaiting triage. Mercer demonstrated proper hand placement on the rubber chest, counting compressions allowed while students scrolled through phones and checked the clock and wondered if this would be on the test. His voice was mechanical. His movements were textbook. He was going through the motions of saving lives while his own life disintegrated in a federal holding facility 70 miles away. But at the Pentagon, everything was different. The ceremony room held 200 people. Military brass in dress uniforms. Intelligence officials. Hospital administrators flown in from Savannah on a weekend to witness something they didn't fully understand but recognized as significant. Daniel Martinez sat in the front row wearing his mother's unit patch pinned to his jacket, the fabric worn soft from handling. Admiral Kessler stood at the podium in full dress uniform, fully recovered, his voice steady and command certain. Elena stood beside him in Marine captain's dress blues. The Silver Star gleamed. The Purple Hearts gleamed. The Navy Cross gleamed. Every medal told a story of bleeding for strangers, of carrying weight that wasn't yours to carry, of choosing to break cover when breaking meant everything would change. For 5 years, Admiral Kessler said, his voice carrying across the room like a bell being rung in a cathedral, Captain Martinez maintained an undercover operation that prevented 4 separate foreign intelligence attempts to compromise classified information. She did this while working 60-hour weeks as a cardiac nurse. She did this while raising a son alone. She did this while enduring systematic workplace harassment designed to force her resignation. 3 weeks ago, she made the decision to break her cover to save my life, knowing it would end her mission. Knowing it would cost her everything she'd built. He turned to Elena. Night Angel, you carried me out of Ramadi when I was a lieutenant commander that nobody important would miss. Yesterday I learned you've been protecting me ever since. From threats I never knew existed. From people I never would have understood were looking. You did that work in silence. You did that work while being called inadequate. You did that work while being threatened with destruction. A Navy captain approached with a certificate embossed in gold and a commendation medal on a blue ribbon. Captain Martinez, the captain said, on behalf of Naval Intelligence and the Department of Defense, this commendation recognizes your extraordinary service in Operation Silent Shield. The room erupted. Military personnel stood. Administrators stood. Daniel wiped his eyes and stood. The applause sounded like rain on a tin roof, like hundreds of people suddenly understanding something they'd never seen before. Elena remained perfectly still, composure intact, but her hand found Daniel's shoulder, and that was everything anyone needed to know about what this moment meant. That evening, Elena and Daniel sat on their apartment balcony in Savannah. The air was warm and thick with salt from the river. Daniel was holding the commendation certificate, reading the gold-embossed text for the 5th time. So you weren't just a nurse, he said. Elena smiled, a real smile, not a military smile. I was always a nurse. That part was real. She touched the unit patch on his jacket. The mission was real too. Both things can be true at the same time. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, the way he'd been quiet since everything changed. Then he said, the Marine recruiter called again. Elena didn't react with surprise or fear or any of the things mothers are supposed to feel when their children consider following them into service. She just nodded slowly. Then we'll talk about it. Really talk. About what it costs. About what it's worth. All of it. 6 weeks later, Dr. Mercer set up plastic CPR mannequins in a community college classroom. He arranged them in rows like a field hospital awaiting casualties. Early arrival students trickled in, community volunteers, healthcare workers looking for certification renewal, people taking the class because their insurance required it. Nobody recognized him. Nobody would have known he'd once been someone important. Through the classroom window, he could see a billboard across the street. Cedar Creek Medical's new Veterans Care Program. Admiral Kessler shaking hands with hospital leadership. In small text at the bottom, directed by Captain Elena Martinez, USMC, RET, VP of Veterans Services. Mercer turned away from the window. He began his lecture on proper hand placement. Fingers interlocked. Push hard and fast. 30 compressions followed by 2 breaths. The rhythm of saving lives recited by a man who'd spent his own life destroying them. The room was quiet except for his voice and the shuffle of people taking seats. Nobody was paying attention. Nobody cared. He was background noise in their lives, the way he'd spent 5 years being background noise in Elena's. In Savannah, Elena walked through Cedar Creek's new veterans clinic. She greeted patients by name. She remembered their families. She knew their medications and their fears and their dreams. Her uniform was replaced with professional civilian clothes, but her posture remained military straight, the kind of posture that comes from carrying weight, from understanding responsibility, from knowing what it means to put someone else's survival above your own comfort. Admiral Kessler visited for his monthly cardiac check. His numbers were strong. His ejection fraction had improved beyond medical expectations. When he saw Elena in the clinic corridor, he embraced her like family, not the formal embrace of officer to officer, but the embrace of someone to someone. "Thank you," he said quietly into her shoulder. "For all of it. For Ramadi. For 5 years of protection. For breaking cover to save me. For everything." Elena held the embrace for a moment longer than protocol would have allowed. "You would have done the same for me," she said. "I would," he agreed. "But I didn't have to. You did it anyway." Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. That's what Elena had learned carrying wounded Marines through Ramadi. That's what she'd learned again saving one admiral's life at the cost of her mission, at the cost of her career, at the cost of everything she'd built in silence. Some people collect power like currency. Others spend it when it matters most. That's the difference between those who survive and those who truly live. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, if you've ever hidden your strength to protect someone else, if you've ever chosen to help instead of hide, hit subscribe. Comment below with your story. The ones who've seen the worst are often the ones who give the most. Let's celebrate them.